Welcome to the debate. We are, conceptually at least, standing in the shadow of the Roman arena, the Colosseum, a structure that was built to be the ultimate engine of imperial power. I mean, it was a stage where life and death were decided before thousands, and it was designed very explicitly to enforce compliance through blood, spectacle, and fear. And yet, when you look at the historical accounts, you're faced with this profound, almost terrifying irony. The calculated violence often backfired completely. Executions that were intended to crush the Christian movement, well, they ended up fueling its rapid spread.
And that failure of coercion is, it's one of the most significant paradoxes in that entire period. Rome essentially created the greatest platform for the spread of the faith, even as it was desperately trying to extinguish it.
Precisely. And this brings us to our core question for today. How do we explain this historical failure? Was the strengthening effect of Christian martyrdom primarily due to the internal spiritual convictions shown by the martyrs, their faith, their hope, that absolute lack of fear? Or was it fundamentally an act of external political subversion that was designed to publicly defy Roman authority? I'm going to argue that the spiritual testimony was the primary engine of that growth.
It'd all be coming at it from a slightly different angle. I believe the decisive factor was actually the political refusal, the very public denial of the emperor's divinity, that made these deaths such a potent, almost existential challenge to the foundation of Roman governance itself.
See, I think a focus on politics misses the source of the power that was being demonstrated. My claim is that the real strength of martyrdom came from its demonstration of a spiritual reality that Rome, it just could not comprehend or defeat. The arena was meant to inspire terror, but the recorded actions of the condemned were, utterly transcendent. Witnesses observed that the Christians did not beg, they didn't curse their tormentors. Instead, you have all these accounts of them praying or singing hymns or just standing in this absolute silence, eyes lifted, unafraid.
They were certainly revealing a powerful internal state.
Absolutely. They revealed their faith through that courage, and that courage became contagious. What you see in the historical record, really, is this striking dichotomy. Rome operated entirely on fear. It used the visible spectacle of death to mandate obedience. But the church endured by hope. It was that observable, inexplicable peace, that profound stillness in the face of violent death that resonated with the people watching. It catalyzed belief because it suggested the existence of a higher power, a different king, whose jurisdiction just surpassed the emperor's.
That's true. That internal peace is undeniable. But I think you are dangerously disconnecting that inner state from the radical public act it was wrapped in. My argument is that the spiritual witness only gained its radical, world-changing power because it was positioned directly in confrontation with the empire's ultimate authority.
So you're emphasizing the legal charges over the actual spiritual effect on the crowd.
I have to emphasize the charges because they dictated how the crowd and, more importantly, how the state understood the action. The Christians were accused of refusing the gods and, crucially, of explicitly denying the emperor. To Rome, this wasn't some theological nuance. The Roman authorities defined this behavior as political treason. So by publicly refusing the emperor inside the arena, which was the state's primary symbol of power, the martyrs weren't just demonstrating personal piety. They were transforming an execution into a public declaration that the state's power was conditional.
I understand that Rome certainly defined the charges as political treason, but that framing, I think, it entirely misses the true source of the martyrs' power, which originated outside the realm of imperial jurisdiction. Look, if it were merely a political act, the spectacle of death, the sheer brutality of blood soaking the sand, the bodies falling, it should have produced the intended result, widespread fear and compliance. But it didn't. And this failure of fear to transmit is, for me, the ultimate evidence that the spiritual component was primary.
I understand the focus on internal peace, but the reason that peace was so disruptive was precisely because it occurred during a highly public act of political subversion. I mean, you can't really separate the spiritual act from the treasonous context that made it so potent. The willingness of men, women, even children to endure death for that political refusal, that was the true threat that strengthened the movement.
Okay, then let's look at the mechanism of transmission itself. You talk about the political threat, but I would focus on how the message actually traveled. The accounts say the stories traveled beyond the arena, through homes, through markets, through the underground church. Now that suggests an intimate, almost viral spreading of courage and hope, an emotional contagion, not a political platform. The sight of people willing to die for what they believed was true generated conviction through empathy and, an inner revelation.
That's a compelling description of the spread, I grant you. But I think the arena was the engine that gave those private stories their explosive force. I would counter that the witness of the martyrs spoke so loudly because it was first a public proclamation before the crowd. The initial event, that ultimate display of state power, is what validated all the subsequent private narratives.
What do you mean by validated?
Well, think about it. If the executions were performed privately, say in prisons, they would have remained isolated spiritual acts. They wouldn't have mobilized the church in the same way. The internal courage, your spiritual attribute, it becomes almost irrelevant without the public spectacle, the political loudspeaker. It was the public failure of the symbol of power to terrorize its victims that gave those stories their gravitas. So the spiritual conviction was the fuel, I agree, but the political confrontation in the arena was the stage and the high-volume speaker that transmitted the challenge.
I think we can both readily agree that the result was the same. Christianity was strengthened dramatically.
Absolutely. But what we're debating is the nature of that strengthening effect. Does the growth rely more on the martyrs' passive endurance, the spiritual lack of fear, the singing, the praying that transcended the violence, or on their active refusal, the explicitly treasonous denial of the gods and the emperor that politically undermined the state?
I still maintain that the endurance is the stronger factor. It's the hope that defeats the fear. That is the fundamental spiritual dichotomy that the historical record draws for us. The focus shifts from what Rome demanded, which was worship, to what the Christians possessed, which was peace.
And I would insist the refusal is the strongest factor, because it demonstrated so clearly that Rome's ultimate power, the power of death, was not the ultimate authority for these people, and that refusal wasn't a quiet contemplation, it was a direct public challenge to the state sovereignty, staged on its own turf.
Well, it's clear that the Acts of the Martyrs contain both profound spiritual testimony and, yes, intense political defiance. The paradox persists because both of those elements are so strong.
Indeed, there are complex historical figures whose witness still, it still speaks precisely because they simultaneously embodied faith and refused empire. And I think examining these accounts through both of those lenses, spiritual transcendence and political subversion, is really essential to fully appreciate the depth of the paradox of the arena.